My sister married a man who insisted on editing my autistic son out of his wedding photos. But when she heard everything he said, she kicked him out of the house immediately. Just over a month ago, my younger sister had her wedding. It was an elegant and well-planned event with months of preparation behind every detail. My sister had always dreamed of that day. And apparently, so had her now ex-husband. However, what began as a day full of excitement and hope ended with my sister making one of the most difficult and courageous decisions I have ever seen in my life. A bit of context so you understand better: my son has autism. He is an incredibly sweet and bright child. But I'm not going to lie. The path has been hard. Every day, we face challenges as a family. From therapies to dealing with the reactions of people who don't understand what it means to live with this condition. Despite everything, we have learned to focus on his strengths. And he is the light of our lives. But that doesn't mean that everyone in our family has been equally understanding from the beginning. My sister insisted that she wanted my son to be present at her wedding. This was very meaningful to me because I knew that big events can be difficult for him. But my sister adores him and has always been one of the few people who manages to calm him when he feels overwhelmed. She even adapted some things at her wedding to make sure he could be comfortable. Like a quiet room where he could relax if he needed to. Her then-fiancé seemed to support all of this. Although I must admit that I didn't know him well enough to know if he was truly sincere. A couple of weeks before the wedding, my sister called me excitedly saying that she wanted my son to carry the rings to the altar. My heart almost burst with joy upon hearing that. She knew how important it was for us to include our son in family events. Not just as a guest but as someone who actively participates. We accepted immediately, albeit with a bit of nervousness about how he might react at such a large event. Everything seemed to be going well. My son was practicing carrying the rings. And my sister visited him regularly to encourage him. It was during one of those visits that the first sign of trouble occurred. My sister arrived a bit quieter than usual. And after my son went to his room, she told me that her fiancé had made some strange comments about including him in the family wedding photos. According to her, he had suggested that perhaps it wasn't necessary for him to be in all the photos since he might distract attention from the moment. My sister had confronted him immediately, but he insisted that it was just an idea to maintain the visual harmony of the photos. Although she believed him, his attitude left an uncomfortable feeling in the air. The wedding day arrived. And at first, everything seemed perfect. My son was wearing a small suit that made him look like a real gentleman. He was so excited that he couldn't stop smiling. When it was time to walk down the aisle with the rings, he did it wonderfully. And my sister's smile upon seeing him was pure pride. All the guests applauded. And for a moment, I felt that everything was fine. But that peace wouldn't last long. During the reception, my brother-in-law asked me to talk to him in private. What he said left me completely speechless. In a secluded corner of the reception, my brother-in-law began with a tone that was intended to be kind but had a clearly uncomfortable undertone. He told me that although he understood that my son was important to my sister and me, he wanted to ask me for a special favor regarding the wedding photos. I frowned, trying to understand where he was going. I want to make sure that the photos reflect the perfection of the day. You know, an unforgettable moment for everyone. He paused as if searching for the words. I think some images would be more harmonious if your son wasn't in them. I don't mean it in a bad way, but his presence could divert attention from the central purpose of the photos. Celebrating our union. I felt a knot in my stomach. Was I hearing right? This man, who had just married my sister and had become part of our family, was implying that my son somehow ruined their wedding photos. I stared at him, trying to contain my anger but not avoiding the response. What are you trying to say exactly? Do you want my son to magically disappear from your photos? Because if that's the case, I think you have a big problem understanding what it means to be part of a family. I said without raising my voice, but firmly enough for him to understand that I wasn't going to tolerate that kind of comment. He raised his hands, trying to smooth things over. No, that's not it. I'm just saying that maybe we could edit some photos to make them look more professional. Nothing personal. It's just for aesthetics. My disbelief turned into a mixture of rage and sadness. I couldn't believe that someone could be so insensitive, especially towards a child who had worked so hard to be part of that special day. I responded immediately. My son is not an accessory that you can just remove to make your photos look pretty. He is a person. And if you have a problem with that, you should reconsider your priorities. However, my brother-in-law didn't seem to understand the gravity of what he was saying. He continued to insist, this time even proposing to hire a professional editor and pay for it out of his own pocket. According to him, this wouldn't be erasing my son but adapting the images to make them more coherent. I felt like every word that came out of his mouth was a direct blow to my son and everything we had worked for as a family to normalize his condition. The conversation ended abruptly when I told him that I wasn't going to discuss the issue any further and that if he really had a problem, he should talk to my sister. I returned to the reception, trying to act as if nothing had happened. But inside, I was furious. I couldn't believe that someone could be so cruel and selfish, especially on a day that was supposed to be about love and unity. Later that night, while the party continued, I noticed that my sister seemed uncomfortable. She was dancing with my son, but her gaze constantly drifted towards her husband, who was sitting in the background with a visibly annoyed expression. I didn't know what had happened between them, but something told me that my brother-in-law had tried to drag her into his side on this issue. The next day, my sister called me. Her voice was trembling, and I could tell she had been crying. She apologized to me, although she wasn't the one who needed to apologize. She told me that her husband had insisted on the idea of editing the photos and that she had clearly told him that it wasn't going to happen. According to my sister, he had reacted defensively, saying that she wasn't considering his vision for their wedding day. I told her, if he can't accept my nephew as he is, then he can't accept my family. And if he can't accept my family, how can he be my husband? Her voice broke when she said this, and I felt incredibly proud of her. Although I knew how difficult it must have been to face this situation so soon after getting married. Even though she had talked to him, things didn't seem to improve. My brother-in-law continued to insist that the photos were important and that editing my son was a simple solution to what he considered a problem. My sister was completely torn between her love for him and her loyalty to our family. The situation reached a critical point when we received a message in the family group that my brother-in-law had sent to all the members. In the message, he said that he understood that some people didn't agree with his ideas about the photos, but that he was willing to take responsibility for editing the images to reflect his vision of the day. The message unleashed chaos. My mother, who until that moment had tried to remain neutral, blew up and called him on the phone to make it clear that his behavior was unacceptable. My father, generally more calm, also intervened, saying that if he couldn't accept our family, he had no place in it. Even some cousins and other relatives who had been at the wedding began to question his attitude. What happened next changed everything completely. It all exploded a couple of days after the group message. My sister called a meeting at my parents' house to talk about the issue face to face. She wanted to resolve it once and for all. But I don't think anyone was prepared for what was really going to happen. We arrived early that afternoon. My son stayed at home with my husband because after everything that had happened, I didn't want to expose him to more drama. My parents, my sister, and I waited in the living room. When my brother-in-law arrived, he had barely crossed the door when my mother looked at him with an expression that said it all. She wasn't going to tolerate his snubs anymore. However, it was my sister who spoke first. First, I want you to explain here in front of everyone why you think it's acceptable to ask for something as disrespectful as editing my nephew out of the photos, she began, her voice firm but charged with emotion. My brother-in-law, without showing a shred of remorse, launched a vague excuse about how the photos were a representation of the beginning of their life together and that he wanted them to be perfect. When my sister asked him what was imperfect about my son, his answer was so cruel that it left everyone stunned. It's not him specifically, but the autism. His behavior. His way of interacting. It just doesn't fit with what I imagined for that day, he said, shrugging as if he were talking about an out-of-place decoration. My father got up immediately, his face red with anger, and pointed towards the door. If that's what you think, you have nothing more to do here. Get out. But my sister stopped him. No, Dad. I want to hear it all. I want him to say exactly what he thinks so that it's clear who I'm married to. It was then that my brother-in-law, perhaps feeling supported by his own ego, began to rant. He said that his wedding day wasn't about accommodating a special child and that he didn't understand why our family couldn't simply make a small sacrifice to preserve the aesthetics of the event. He also implied that if our family really supported him, We would have agreed to pay for a professional editor without question. The words felt like daggers. My mother began to cry. And my father, normally the pillar of calm, hit the table with such force that the noise echoed throughout the house. But my sister, with tears in her eyes, remained firm. So, for you, my nephew is just an inconvenience, a distraction. Is that what you think of the people I care about? Because if that's the case, you have nothing to do in my life. Her voice didn't tremble. And at that moment, I knew that my sister was about to make a decision that would change everything. He tried to justify himself, saying that he wasn't talking about the whole family but specifically about my son. He said that the child was adorable but that his presence added unnecessary complications to an event like a wedding. He also made it clear that he believed that we, as parents, were exaggerating by expecting everyone to treat my son like any other child. That was the breaking point for my sister. She stood up with a calmness that impressed me and spoke with a clarity that left everyone in the room speechless. You're not only insulting my nephew, you're insulting my entire family and myself. I decided to marry you because I thought you were a person who understood what it means to love and accept others. But I was clearly wrong. If you can't see my nephew as part of my family, then you can't be part of my life. He began to protest, trying to calm her down. But it was already too late. My sister had made her decision. She asked him to leave and told him that she didn't want to talk to him until he sought help to understand why his attitude was so toxic. It was a difficult scene to witness. But we all knew that my sister was doing the right thing. That night, after my brother-in-law left, we stayed with her, providing the support she needed. My mother, who had been crying throughout the conversation, hugged my sister and told her how much she admired her for making that decision. My father, with tears in his eyes, simply said, "I'm proud of you." Although my sister was devastated, she also felt a kind of relief. She knew that her decision had been the right one, although the pain was inevitable. In the following days, she received multiple messages from her husband that ranged from half-hearted apologies to reproaches. He tried to tell her that she was being dramatic and that all of this could be resolved if she put aside her emotions. But she didn't give in. A couple of days after my sister asked her husband to leave, his parents called her. At first, she thought that perhaps they wanted to mediate the situation or at least try to understand what had happened. But as soon as she answered the call, it became clear that they had no intention of being reasonable. Her husband's mother began with an exaggeratedly condescending voice. "Dear, I understand that this has been difficult for you, but I think you're being a bit harsh with my son. Don't you think you could have handled this more discreetly? After all, it's normal for a couple to want their wedding photos to be perfect." My sister was stunned. She took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, and responded firmly. "Perfect? You mean my nephew ruined your photos? Because if that's what you think, there's not much more to discuss." Her husband's mother tried to smooth things over. No, I'm not saying that exactly. I just think that maybe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe all of this can be resolved if you both give in a little. How about if my son pays for the edits? So you don't have to worry about anything?" It was at that moment that my sister lost her patience. "Give in? What part of 'I'm not going to erase my nephew from the photos' don't you understand? This is not something negotiable. My nephew is part of my life. And if your son can't accept it, he has no place in it. What kind of person suggests something so cruel? And worse, what kind of mother justifies it?" The conversation ended abruptly when my sister hung up, unable to listen anymore. From that moment on, her husband's parents began to send her messages, alternating between trying to persuade her and, in some cases, blaming her for the situation. They said things like, "Marriages have their ups and downs, but what you're doing is an exaggeration and you're the reason why our family is falling apart." The messages did nothing but strengthen my sister's determination. She knew that she was not only facing her husband but also a whole system of toxic beliefs that justified his behavior. Our family supported her 100%. And the more her husband's parents talked, the clearer it became that there was no solution to this. A few days later, things took an unexpected turn. My brother-in-law appeared unannounced at my parents' house with flowers in hand and an apparently rehearsed speech. He said that he had reflected and that he was willing to apologize to everyone. He wanted to fix things and promised that he would never again suggest anything that could hurt my nephew. For a moment, I thought my sister might consider listening to him. After all, it was evident that she was devastated by how things had ended. But then, he said something that dashed any possibility of reconciliation. All I ask is that in the future, we don't put your nephew at the center of everything. I want our relationship to have priority. That's all. My sister looked at him firmly with an expression that mixed disbelief and sadness. Is that what you understand as an apology? To ask that my nephew be relegated so that you are more comfortable? No, this isn't just about him. This is about you. Your priorities. And how I'll never be able to trust that you respect my family. You can leave. He tried to argue. But my sister didn't give him a chance. She kicked him out of the house. And this time with a clarity and determination that no one could question. As the days passed, the situation began to become public among friends and family. Many people supported my sister. But there were also those who took her husband's side, saying that she was exaggerating and that she was destroying her marriage over a simple misunderstanding. My sister decided not to get involved in the drama and simply cut contact with all the people who didn't understand her decision. What hurt me the most was when my son, without knowing exactly what had happened, asked me why we hadn't seen his uncle again. I tried to explain it to him in the simplest way possible, telling him that sometimes people don't know how to behave well and that we deserve to be surrounded by love and respect. He seemed to accept the explanation, but it hurt me to know that he would never fully understand the gravity of what had happened. A month after my sister kicked out her husband, she decided to begin the divorce process. It wasn't an easy decision, and we all knew it. She had invested so much in that relationship, believing that she was building a future with someone who loved and respected her. However, after weeks of reflection, she realized that she couldn't be with someone who didn't share her most fundamental values. For her, family had always been the most important thing, and the fact that her husband not only couldn't accept her nephew but also tried to minimize his importance was something she couldn't ignore. The legal process was relatively quick since the marriage had lasted a short time and they didn't have many assets in common. Even so, the conversations and meetings with the lawyers were emotionally exhausting. On more than one occasion, my sister arrived at my parents' house after a session completely broken. But every time she began to doubt her decision, she remembered the words of her ex-husband and the pain he had caused to our family. And that strengthened her. Meanwhile, her ex-husband's parents didn't stop sending her messages, trying to convince her to reconsider. They went so far as to send her an extensive letter saying that no one is perfect and that their son deserved another chance. They even tried to use my nephew as an argument, saying that a family that teaches forgiveness is an example for children. My sister, with the dignity that characterized her, didn't respond. She knew that any attempt to interact with them would only prolong the pain. In parallel, my brother-in-law didn't stop trying to reconcile. At one point, he even hired a couples therapist, sending the information to my sister and asking her to attend with him. But it was too late. His apologies were nothing more than empty words since he never showed a real change in his attitude or a genuine understanding of what he had done wrong. His focus continued to be on how to fix things for him without acknowledging the damage he had caused to my sister, my nephew, and our entire family. During this time, my nephew remained oblivious to much of the conflict. We did everything possible to make sure that he didn't feel the weight of the situation. However, there was a moment that marked me deeply. One day, while playing in the garden, my son approached me and said, "Mom, do you think my uncle got angry with me because I didn't carry the rings well?" My heart broke when I heard him. I hugged him and assured him, not something that adults didn't know how to handle. It was at that moment that I fully understood why my sister had made the decision she made. No one deserves to be in a relationship with someone who is not only incapable of accepting the people you love but can also cause so much pain with their words and actions. Her decision not only protected my nephew but also sent a clear message: we will not tolerate attitudes of exclusion, selfishness, or lack of empathy, no matter where they come from. Finally, the divorce was officially finalized 3 months after the wedding. My sister, although emotionally exhausted, began to rebuild her life. She decided to focus on her work and her relationship with our family. She also began attending therapy, which helped her process everything that had happened and reaffirm her self-esteem. She had always been a strong woman, but this process made her even more resilient. As for us as a family, The experience brought us even closer. My sister spent more time with my son, taking him for walks, playing with him, and making sure that he never felt that his presence was a burden. My nephew adored her even more for it. And seeing them together was a reminder that despite everything we had been through, love and support will always prevail. There was one last attempt at reconciliation by the ex-husband months after the divorce. He appeared unannounced at my parents' house, saying that he had changed and that he wanted another chance. This time, my sister didn't even open the door. From the window, she told him that there was nothing more to talk about and that he should move on with his life. It was a moment of definitive closure, and we all supported her in her decision.